Get on a train in Britain and get on a train in Germany, and you will feel it straight away. The German one is bigger, taller inside, wider, roomier. The British one feels like it was built for smaller people, and in a way it was. Britain, the country that invented the railway, the country that gave trains to the entire planet, runs some of the smallest trains in the developed world. And the reason why is one of the great ironies in all of engineering. Britain's trains are small precisely because Britain was first. Now, before we go any further, we have to clear up the one thing everybody gets wrong about this. Because if you get it wrong, a room full of railwaymen will correct you instantly. This is not about the track gauge. Before we get into it, hit subscribe and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. We want to know who's out there. The track gauge is the distance between the two rails. And here is the thing that surprises people. Britain's track gauge is exactly the same as Germany's, France's, most of America's, and about 60% of the entire world's railways. 4 feet 8.5 inches. It is called standard gauge, and it exists because a man named George Stephenson used it on the very first mainline railways in the north of England in the 1820s, having borrowed it from the colliery wagonways he grew up around. When his railways succeeded, the whole world copied the exact width of his track. So the rails under a British train sit exactly as far apart as the rails under a German one. That is not the difference. The difference is something called the loading gauge, and this is the part almost nobody outside the railway understands. The loading gauge is not the track. It is the size of the tunnel. It is the height of the bridge. It is the gap to the platform. It is the invisible envelope of empty space that a train has to fit through as it travels down the line. You can have the exact same width of track in two countries, and if one country built taller bridges and wider tunnels, that country can run bigger trains. The track is the same. The hole the train has to fit through is not, and Britain's hole is the smallest in the world. Great Britain has, in general, the most restrictive loading gauge relative to its track gauge of any major railway on Earth. So how did the country that invented the railway end up with the smallest trains? Here is the irony, and it is a beautiful one. Britain was first. That is the whole answer right there. When British engineers built the first railways in the 1820s and 1830s, nobody knew how big trains were going to get. There was no plan, no standard, no government rule book. There were just dozens of separate private companies, each one building its own line, digging its own tunnels, throwing up its own bridges, each to whatever size seemed sensible at the time. And the trains of the 1830s were tiny, little four-wheeled things. So the tunnels they carved and the bridges they built were sized for those little trains. Because why would you spend a fortune boring a tunnel bigger than the trains that would ever use it? Then, the railway grew up. Trains got bigger everywhere. But by the time the rest of the world was building its railways, they had watched Britain do it first, and they had learned. Countries like Germany and France and America built their networks later, on open land, with the benefit of hindsight, and they made their tunnels and bridges bigger from the start. They left room to grow. Britain never did, because when Britain dug those tunnels, there was no example to learn from. Britain was the example. There is one more twist to this, and it involves the one man who tried to do it right. His name was Isambard Kingdom Brunel, probably the greatest engineer Britain ever produced. When he built the Great Western Railway in the late 1830s, he looked at Stephenson's narrow track and thought it was far too small for the fast, heavy trains he could see coming. So he did something bold. He built his railway to a gauge of 7 feet and 1/4 of an inch, more than 2 feet wider than everybody else. It was called the broad gauge, and by every account, it was better, smoother, faster, more stable. His trains were roomier and quicker than anything else in the country. But Brunel had a problem. Everybody else was using Stephenson's narrow gauge, and there were 8 times more miles of it than there was of Brunel's broad gauge. Where the two systems met, at places like Gloucester, it was chaos. Passengers and freight had to be physically dragged off one train and loaded onto another, just because the tracks were different widths. It could not go on. In 1846, Parliament stepped in and passed the Gauge Act, and it ruled that all new railways had to be built to Stephenson's narrow standard, not because it was better. Everyone admitted Brunel's was better, but because there was simply so much more of it already in the ground. Brunel's broad gauge held on in the west of England for decades, a stubborn island of bigger, better trains. But it was doomed. Over a single weekend in May 1892, an army of railway workers ripped up the last of it, converting hundreds of miles of Brunel's masterpiece to the narrow standard, and the dream of a bigger British railway died with it. Britain was locked in forever to the smaller size. And it stayed locked in right up to today. This is not ancient history with no consequences. It shapes the British Railway right now, this minute. The most obvious example is the double-decker train. Go to France, Germany, Switzerland, the Netherlands, and you will see trains with 2 full floors of passengers stacked on top of each other, doubling the capacity of a single train. Britain, with some of the most crowded trains in Europe, would love that. But it cannot have it. The bridges are too low. The tunnels are too tight. A standard European double-decker simply will not fit through the British network, and to make it fit, you would have to rebuild every tunnel and raise every bridge on the line, at a cost so astronomical nobody will ever pay it. They actually tried once. In 1949, an engineer named Oliver Bulleid, a man famous for wild ideas, managed to cram a sort of double-decker into the tiny British loading gauge. Because a real double-decker would not fit, he cheated, building carriages with alternating high and low compartments, interlocked like a puzzle. It technically carried about 1/3 more people, but the upper compartments were cramped and stuffy with windows that did not open. They took forever to load and unload, and passengers hated them so much they would rather stand downstairs than climb up. The experiment limped along until 1971 and was never repeated. Even now, the cost of Britain's small size is measured in real money. When Britain builds new high-speed trains that have to run on the old Victorian network, they cost dramatically more because they have to be specially designed and built narrow to squeeze through those 19th century tunnels instead of being bought off the shelf like everyone else's. The country pays a premium decade after decade for tunnels that were dug when Queen Victoria was young. So that is why British trains are the smallest in the world. Not because the track is narrow, the track is the same as everyone else's. It is because Britain was the pioneer, and the pioneer builds blind. Britain carved its tunnels and raised its bridges before anyone on Earth knew how big a train would one day need to be. And then the entire nation was trapped inside the shape of its own head start. Every other country got to learn from Britain's example. Britain had no example to learn from. The country that gave railways to the world built its own too small to ever grow, and it has been squeezing its trains through those Victorian holes in the ground ever since.